Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to this fifth hearing of the International Parliamentary Inquiry into the global response to the crisis in Myanmar. My name is Heidi Hautala. I am the chair of this inquiry, and I'm also Vice President of the European Parliament. And I am speaking to you from Finland. So we will have other committee members of this inquiry with us a bit later. I can at this moment welcome our Indonesian Member of Parliament colleague Taufik Basari, and I will welcome others when they will arrive. So I just want to remind you about why we are doing this. We are doing it precisely because we want to provide a distinctly different and parliamentary response to these appalling atrocities which the Myanmar military has perpetrated since the coup in February last year. So that's now 1.5 years. And we have this oral hearing only days after the Myanmar junta has executed 4 political prisoners. So this is the first time that a judicial execution has been carried out in Myanmar since 1988. This is yet another low for the junta, and on behalf of the International Parliamentary Inquiry Committee, I would like to express the strongest condemnation of these political assassinations and our deepest condolences to the families of those executed. In the face of the turmoil which engulfs Myanmar, global responses have fallen far short of the expectations of the Myanmar people and of international obligations and standards. There is a legitimate concern that the international community's failure to impact change in Myanmar not only legitimizes the junta by default, but also it risks to embolden other brutal regimes by showing that atrocities can occur with impunity. And of course, we have a major humanitarian crisis to face and solve. So this parliamentary inquiry will provide policy recommendations for effective action that international actors can take in an effort to save the lives, health and livelihoods of millions of Myanmar people and prevent the further occurrence of international crimes. While we are inviting witnesses to our hearings, we also call for written submissions and we request for information. And we want to make it absolutely clear that the final report will be the result of the collective editorial decisions of the committee members. So the International Parliamentary Inquiry strives to abide by the highest standards of collegiality and mutual respect across genders, ages, and cultures in its work. We will hear from 3 witnesses today, and we will save the remaining time, perhaps 30 minutes after the final speaker, for any last questions to or remarks by the witnesses. So now I am sad to say that Mr. Aung Myo Min, Minister for Human Rights of the National Unity Government, is not able to be with us today for personal reasons. But I am happy to welcome Mr. Jason Tower, who is the Burma Country Director at the United States Institute for Peace. And I also welcome Mr. Kil Dietz, who is Policy Consultant for Myanmar at Global Witness. And I want to welcome Mr. Nicholas Kumjian, Head of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, the IIMM. So let me now go to the first witness, but I would like to say that he is indeed a country director for the United States Institute for Peace for the Burma program, and before this function he served in senior positions with several other peace-building organizations in China and Southeast Asia. He's fluent in Mandarin and has published widely on China's involvement in peace and security issues. So Jason, please take the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak to the esteemed panel. I was asked to offer some remarks on the regional level response to the crisis in Myanmar and particularly to look at some of the dynamics around China's policy removes with respect to Myanmar since February and how that has impacted the situation in Myanmar. So before I get to that, just very briefly, I wanted, for those who do not know the United States Institute of Peace, just to say that the Institute is an independent, nonpartisan institute that was established by the US Congress in 1984 that works on the mitigation and prevention of violent conflict. The Institute has been active in Burma since 2012, and we work globally in conflict hotspots as well as out of our headquarters in Washington. I wanted to add also that the views shared here today are my own views and do not represent necessarily those of the Institute and certainly not of the US government. So I thought I would highlight three main points in looking at some of the aspects and challenges around the regional level response to the increasingly horrific situation in Myanmar as we're seeing the junta execute more and more intense and extreme forms of violence against the Myanmar people. First, I'd like to look at how the evolution of China's policy response over the past 18 months has impacted ASEAN's response, has undermined to a great extent any prospects for political dialogue towards resolving the crisis. And it has also, in many senses, I think, represented something of a barrier to the implementation of the 5-point consensus. Secondly, I'd like to take another look at China's interests in Myanmar and how they're being impacted by the current situation, as I think this also could be relevant to thinking through how different regional level stakeholders might consider different strategies for dialogue or engagement with China, given the level of influence that it in fact has on the situation in Myanmar. And then thirdly, to think through a couple of those different options that might be there both for ASEAN states and for other key international actors, given a lot of the challenges and deadlock that we see at the regional level when it comes to policy responses. So on the first of those points, I'll speak a little bit to China's response since February 1st, 2021. I think the first thing that I feel that it's really critical to highlight is that when the ASEAN 5-point consensus was negotiated, China maintained a much more nuanced policy towards Myanmar than it does at the present time. And you've seen since last April that China's stance has shifted from one which publicly gave some level of recognition to the NLD party with the Chinese Foreign Ministry's official statements mentioning the NLD party by name, with the Chinese Communist Party inviting the NLD party to join public events and participate in some of its party-to-party dialogue mechanisms. You've seen it shift from that much more towards a stance of building closer and closer ties with the State Administrative Council, and gradually dropping some of the language from in its official statements, which emphasized the legitimacy of the NLD party. So this, I think, is one of the key shifts that we've seen in the period since the coup, with China, at the time the ASEAN 5-point consensus was negotiated, looking at the situation where you had many stakeholders that it wasn't encouraging dialogue between, towards now really, I think, having made a decision that it wants to move forward much more with business as normal with the SAC. I think that this shift has had some impacts and implications on efforts around the ASEAN 5-point consensus, as given the level of influence that China had it continued, its public messaging around the NLD party, had it continued working to try to set red lines with the military regarding the need to respect the legitimacy of that party, maintain the legality of that party, and also red lines with respect to violence, I think it may have been more possible for ASEAN countries to, in fact, build more inroads towards political dialogue and towards maybe meeting some of those goals. But unfortunately, by September of 2021, not long before the announcement of the People's Defensive War, that's really, I think, the point of fluctuation where, China began to put pressure on the NLD party. That pressure largely was targeted at asking the NLD party to distance itself from the NUG, telling it to avoid association with PDFs, and really pushing it to try to stick to the 2008 Constitution, which up until now, China continues to assert is the best framework for finding a solution to the crisis. While it might be that some stakeholders in China simply did not understand the position of the NLD or the NLD's relationship with the NUG, I think the reality is that by September of last year, down in Yunnan province, you already had a lot of policymakers getting quite nervous about the lack of progress towards China's economic projects, towards achieving China's strategic objectives in Myanmar, and also increasingly recognizing that the military simply would not accept the 5-point consensus and would not accept dialogue with the NLD or with other key stakeholders who were resisting military control. And so I think with the recognition of that, and with its own publicly stated goal of trying to achieve a soft landing as soon as possible in order that it would be able to advance these economic projects, China decided in the end to tilt its position in the favor of the SAC. Of course, along with that, I think you've seen many local actors in Yunnan province, as you've seen throughout the history of China's relations with Myanmar, play a pretty significant role in influencing decision-making processes in Beijing. You saw, starting from September, October of last year, that it was these actors, local provincial government actors and corporate actors from China's southwest that started advancing new trade initiatives with the junta, that started working on setting up a new consulate with the junta in China's southwestern administrative region of Chongqing, and also beginning to negotiate new business arrangements and projects with the junta side. This phenomena, I think, was further exacerbated by the fact that the junta itself has deep ties to a wide range of actors, both in Yunnan province, also to many commercial, corporate, government actors through its representative in Beijing, who's been, I think, a consistent voice parroting junta narratives to stakeholders in China, and that this, to some extent, also played a role in coloring and influencing Chinese views. But also, I think the mobilization of Chinese businesses and Yunnan provincial government actors gave a sense that moving ahead with business as normal with the junta might, in fact, well be possible. This got, I think, even worse towards the latter part of 2021 and into early 2022, as many Chinese state policy advisors, academics working on Myanmar started to parrot a lot of the junta's narratives. We've seen articles by those affiliated with government think tanks who've referred to the NUG even as a fake NLD party, or parroting some of these narratives around extremism, while completely ignoring the junta's violence and war crimes and the broader chaos going on in country. So I think that these also played a role in helping to shape that shift on the part of China's approach. Now, of course, things really, I think, came full circle in terms of resuming those relations when you saw China invite Wu Namong in April of this year. And that was really the point where I think things became official in terms of China providing that high level of recognition to the SAC. Beyond that, though, you've also now started to see China become much more assertive in trying to influence the trajectory of ASEAN's response by leveraging the Lancang-Mekong Cooperation Forum. And so earlier this month, you saw China, together with Myanmar, SAC host in Myanmar the LMC platform, the foreign ministers of the four Mekong countries, along with the Chinese foreign minister, meeting there in Bagan at a meeting that I think symbolically really gave tremendous levels of recognition to the junta, even though it may be that some of the Mekong countries had some reservations about this. And, I think those reservations are something perhaps to think through and to explore, but certainly the optics of this and the impact and effect it had on the junta, I think have, if anything, emboldened the junta to move further and further away from any notion of maintaining the five-point consensus, and also moved in a direction where they feel like there simply isn't a red line. They can use any form of violence they'd like to, and they'll still have the support of China and some of the neighboring countries as a result of that. I think moving ahead with there now being plans for an LMC summit towards the end of the year, with the Chinese side through the joint law enforcement mechanism of the Mekong Lancang region, now initiating a new campaign cracking down on illegal firearms and weapons together with the junta's police. I think all of these things signal that you're going to see growing levels of not only recognition, but direct support to the junta in trying to achieve the junta's roadmap, and that really is going to make a robust ASEAN response problematic and difficult unless you're able to really, I think, build more leverage over the military in some manner. Now, this leads into the second point, which is around China's interests in country. Certainly, I believe that there's no inherent love or predisposition towards Min Aung Hlai's regime on the part of the Chinese. If anything, China has had a very troubled history with the military and with the USDP party, notably in 2009, the military launching an attack right on the Chinese border in Kokong, taking out one of the very significant Chinese-speaking ethnic armed organizations, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, and generating a major national security threat right on China's border, with refugees being pushed across the border into China. Of course, the Chinese side also, for the past decade, has continued to raise the issue of the Mitsan Dam, which was suspended by the military's proxy party, the USDP. So there are, I think, some elements of distrust that are certainly present within the China-Myanmar relationship. That said, though, China has what I would argue to be three core goals with respect to Myanmar. One is to sustain its geostrategic capture of Myanmar as an outlet for China's southwestern energy security and for overcoming the so-called Malacca dilemma. So opening up access to the Indian Ocean, which gives China a geostrategic advantage in that particular region, but also gives it another channel through which it can ensure its connectivity to the rest of the world. And again, it can further advance its connectivity, its ability to provide trade and provide energy resources back to China. Secondly, is securing the border area and ensuring stability of the border area, and along with that, keeping Western influence out of the border. And then last, pushing back against international norms on democracy and human rights vis-a-vis its periphery, which is something that you've seen China and Russia do consistently, particularly at the UN Security Council and through other multilateral settings. China's current thinking is that boosting the SAC against opposition forces in country represents a pathway for maximizing its interests in these three areas, as again, it's seeing that the SAC is in a very weak position economically. It's more or less going to take whatever deals it possibly can from China. It needs China's strategic support, and it knows that China wants to move ahead with these economic projects. So I think the reality is that China sees a weak SAC as a business partner, as a strategic partner, and as, of course, keeping those Western stakeholders out and enabling it, I think, to really shape the space to its liking, considering that it also keeps those influential relationships with many of the Northern ethnic armed organizations as well. Now, I think there's some critical flaws with this strategy. First of all, this SAC is already illustrating that it has zero capacity to deliver when it comes to the economy. Many of the existing Chinese enterprises, including significant mining operations, have been unable to continue production. The pipeline project, the China-Myanmar pipeline project, has already been attacked and nearly sustained damage on multiple occasions. Along with that, I think in terms of the types of businesses that are being attracted into an environment like Myanmar right now, you're seeing largely that it's, beyond the Chinese state-owned enterprises, illicit business actors who find this type of context quite attractive. So already in the Thai-Myanmar and China-Myanmar borderlands, you're seeing an explosion of Chinese fraud operations, of scams, of different criminal networks. You're seeing an uptick in narcotics seizures. You're seeing an uptick in human trafficking. These sorts of issues, I think, moving down the line, if this strategy continues, I think will only get worse. Along with this, there's limitations in terms of the strategic support, the security support that China is willing to provide. And to a large extent, it's Russia that's providing those more sophisticated types of equipment that the junta is using on the battlefield. That strategy also seems that it's very questionable. There's big questions. I know, again, the Russian foreign minister is arriving today, but will Russia have the capacity to continue to deliver? And if it doesn't have that capacity, will China be willing to step in and provide that level of arms and defense assistance, given the way that it's trying to project a more positive and friendly image around the world? Lastly, I think that we'll also see geostrategic competition increase exponentially as a result of this, particularly as the SAC continues to spin conspiracy theories and narratives to China and Russia and some ASEAN countries, and that this geostrategic competition is also going to make it very difficult for this strategy of China to succeed. So where does that leave us? I guess a couple of thoughts on really options for ASEAN and options for the international community more broadly. First of all, at this point, given that the junta's presence in ASEAN, I think really makes it extremely difficult for ASEAN to play any form of an honest mediating role or to gain any leverage over the junta, that allowing that presence is something that maybe needs to be reconsidered at this point. Should it at this point, given where the military has gone with its abuse of violence against the people, with these executions that we've seen over the past couple of days, but just the ongoing willingness to deploy brutal force against the population, should the military's representation be out entirely, put it on pause for the moment? I think along with that, looking at where you have Myanmar Junta staff within key positions within ASEAN institutions also is something to be considering carefully. I mean, if you have the junta represented in those types of positions, it gives really, I think, the junta an unfair advantage in the ability to manipulate ASEAN's institutions. And I would point out in particular that ASEAN presently the executive director is a representative of the Myanmar junta's police force and someone who is implicated in severe human rights violations and war crimes. Secondly, ASEAN, I think, could also play a role, or individual ASEAN countries, I think, could play a role through their bilateral tracks with China, or even through the ASEAN dialogue partnership with China and other countries, to try to help persuade China to avoid falling into a trap where its southwestern development ends up being held hostage to the SAC's complete and utter lack of capacity to govern. I think by sharing strong analysis on what's going on with the economic situation, on what's going on with criminality, on how this is affecting the borderlands more broadly, that this might be one way of potentially trying to help the Chinese side see that maybe there's other options on the table. Third, I think another option would be reaching out much more strategically to the ethnic armed organizations that are working to provide governance in country, along with the NUG and NLD, to begin collective and long-term discussions about resolution of the crisis. These discussions may necessitate the involvement of other key members of the international community. ASEAN's dialogue partners in particular will be, I think, quite critical here. But I think already you have a growing willingness of many of the ethnic armed organizations, given their own, I think, increasingly bleak outlook for the country, but also the bleak outlook for themselves in terms of their long-term economic prospects. There, I believe, is an increasing desire on the part of significant EAOs, including in Kachin, Rakhine, Karen, Karenni, Chin, to start looking more deeply at what a coordinated action towards ending the military's chaos, towards ending the military's remaining grip over the country's political institutions, looking at what those options might potentially be. And, you know, there potentially could be a role in trying to bring together and convene that group. The fourth point, and maybe I'll wrap up on this, is that I think an immediate dialogue with the Lancang-Mekong countries and the Mekong Dialogue Partnership platforms is something that needs to be considered, particularly with the LMC's joint law enforcement mechanism moving in the direction of actually trying to back the junta's police in taking firearms away or cutting off access to firearms on the part of PDFs. I mean, the reality is that the illegal firearms are those that are in the hands of the MPF and that are being used to perpetrate these war crimes. So if you're going to start to see the LMC move more in the direction of, you know, getting involved, interfering on the side of the junta against the resistance, that's really, I think, a red line and a point that countries that are really interested in trying to do something about the violence need to step in and initiate dialogue around. So let me stop with that, and hopefully there's still some time for discussion and questions after the other interventions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And we also will have a few questions to you directly, and then we can have a broader exchange. So thank you very much for explaining China's strategic interests and objectives in Myanmar. And I find it particularly interesting that you say that, in fact, their closer contacts with the SAC may be a trap because, as you say, the SAC has little capacity to promote and proceed with the business interests of China. So my first question to you would be about this, about these business interests of China in Myanmar. Would you say that now China has to perhaps reconsider, if I understand you well, you say that China may be starting to understand that the State Administrative Council is not the partner for that. And would that change China's approach? Is there a perspective that China would change its perspective to the different forces in Myanmar? And second, let me ask about the armed ethnic groups, because I assume that you have a lot of experience on this sort of peace training with peace negotiations between the ethnic armed groups and the rulers of Myanmar during the previous years. So what could concretely speaking been achieved with the armed ethnic groups, and who would be those stakeholders that should address them? So let me start with these two questions, and if you could answer them, then I refer to my other colleagues. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thanks. No, I think two great questions. I think on the first of these, you know, the Chinese, in terms of economic stakeholders, you know, Chinese state-owned enterprises have, okay. Is my video back on? I'm not sure how it was turned off, but okay. Great. But yeah, so in terms of the Chinese business stakeholders, I think that they're taking a very pragmatic approach. I mean, you did see right after the coup that there was a freeze placed on new loans to state-owned enterprises initiating new projects in Myanmar. That only started to change actually in April of this year, where you did see particularly Chinese power companies start to initiate some new projects on the ground, meaning that once again, access to state capital has now opened for new projects in Myanmar. But a lot of the projects that they're, kind of working on now, or the newer projects anyways that have been announced in Bago and in Mandalay, these largely solar power projects, these projects I think are much smaller footprints than a lot of the bigger infrastructure that China's looking to build out, like the Sino-Myanmar Railroad project, for example. So I think that China's really testing the waters with these projects. It's looking to see, will these solar projects be successful? Will some of these other smaller investments be successful? And then, if it does see that it's able to implement, you'll probably then see, some of the larger stuff begin to move ahead. I don't think we're at the point yet. I mean, certainly, I think that Chinese analysts are very much aware of the economic collapse. I think that the World Bank's reports, the reports that you've seen from Fitch Economics and a lot of the other, reporting, well-known established international groups that do economic reporting, I think that those are going to be accepted pretty much anywhere you go. And most countries are going to see clearly that, yes, there's been a good degree of economic collapse. But I think in terms of the question of whether or not the junta is going to be able to secure these investments, that's something that I don't think China has come to the conclusion that the answer is no to yet. It does seem that there still is the intention to move ahead with new projects. And again, the announcement that there will be a LMC summit meeting in Myanmar next year, in Myanmar before the end of this year. I mean, the implications of that are of China's premier going to Myanmar, which would almost certainly require that there be some kind of set of significant agreements to be signed between the China side and the Myanmar SAC side. So, again, it may be a little bit of a game of wait and see. However, I really think that you haven't kind of come out yet. I don't think Chinese economic actors are at this point yet convinced that the SAC is incapable of moving ahead with some of these projects. I think in terms of the role of ethnic armed organizations, I think across the board, you're seeing that EAOs have gained tremendously in terms of their ability to control, to govern, to provide governance goods, to be able to operate militarily in areas that they haven't in quite a long time, or even to take on new territories. And that's something that you're seeing, I think, these processes of consolidation in Chin, in Karen, Karenni, Rakhine, in Shan states. So it's really all across the map that this is happening. Now, what could EAOs do? I mean, I think as we get closer and closer to a situation of the, Tatmadaw only using violence to sustain itself, there's going to be growing incentives for EAOs even to maybe begin talking with one another, coordinating their military actions more and more, but also coordinating more on the provision of governance goods, because at the end of the day, I mean, they need to also be considering, the different ethnic groups that they're ultimately fighting for in terms of autonomy, right? So the ability of their civilian governance wings to provide those types of resources to be able to do things to sort of shore up their situations in terms of the impacts of the junta's economic malaise and collapse on the economies of ethnic areas. I mean, all of these things I think will take a toll over time. And so, I see there being increasingly a space where EAOs could be coordinating more and more closely with one another, but also with the NUG, with the NLD on trying to find both a way of ending the junta's violence, but then also, I mean, I think along with that, and again, there's conversations right now already within the NUCC, but then thinking about longer term, what is an interim arrangement once you've been able to do something to get the junta in check, to get the military, out of the picture when it comes to the country's politics. what is that interim situation going to look like? I mean, I think finding a way to convene those EAOs, particularly the ones that have been more hesitant around the NUCC process, maybe just having directly those EAOs involved in some way in a type of convening might be one way to, to explore this.
Thank you very much, Jason Tower. So I now refer to my other colleagues. They are 3 of them here. So which of you would want to take the floor first? Charles, you want to start? Do you hear me? Jason, do you hear me?
I hear you, but I don't hear Charles.
Yeah, I'm just looking. Well, Nitipon Piwmow, our colleague from the Thai Parliament. Nitipon, do you want to take the floor? Or Taufik? I think there's a bit of a breakdown of our communication at the moment. But while I'm waiting for their, by the way, please raise your hands when you want to take the floor, so it's easier for me to manage this. But anyway, I just wanted to ask you about this sort of tightening of the conflicts between and contradictions between the autocratic countries and democratic countries. And we have just seen that the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov is going to visit Myanmar. So do you think that this indicates that not only China, but also Russia will get more involved and indeed, as you said, try to keep any attempts to create democratic developments and defend human rights out, and also to try to keep the Western stakeholders out? So are we going to see a kind of a more sharper situation between the autocratic and democratic countries? And will this have an impact on what the Western stakeholders can do to have a return to democracy and respect of human rights in the country?
Yeah, I think we need to look at Russia's involvement here, both through the prism of the China-Russia strategic treaty of amity, as well as through Russia's growing efforts to try to build influence in the Indian Ocean region, which I think is evidenced by the release of the Russian Indian Ocean region strategy this past Sunday. So I see, certainly on one hand, the Russian foreign minister's visit on the way to meetings in Phnom Penh certainly would make sense. I mean, given that Myanmar is going to be a topic of discussion there. But I think also within the context of the release of this strategy, of a growing interest in Russia to try to deepen its relations with India, to deepen its relations with South Asia countries, looking at energy, oil, looking at new markets, given the impacts of sanctions from largely Western countries and other allies around Russia's ongoing attack on the Ukraine. I think that this is all interrelated, and we need to kind of see Russia's moves from this prism. Now, along with that, I think that, the moves that we're seeing right now around Taiwan and Russia's immediate willingness to come to, China's really immediately to announce its desire to provide assistance to China, strategic assistance to China around the Taiwan issue, given the crisis that has emerged there over the past few days, with China taking a very strong approach in trying to prevent a U.S. congressional delegation and trying to, now I think, indicate that Taiwan needs to have some sort of punishment delivered against it, or it seems quite clear from a lot of the statements we've seen over the last 24 hours that at a minimum there's going to be these military drills. It's hard to see immediately what else may follow, but I think that Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, of course, the issue of Myanmar, these are all areas where increasingly that China-Russia partnership is going to be something that I think you're going to see activated more and more. So, I think that there's reason to be concerned about this, reason to be concerned that Russia and China may be looking at this from a prism of trying to deflect or prevent, the restoration of liberal democracy in Myanmar. And I think also that, given the Ukraine issue, the Taiwan issue that are both there, it's also quite likely that the military regime in Myanmar is going to leverage those challenges to try to build more support, build more influence from China and Russia.
Okay, thank you.
Heidi, I have a question. Can I pose it?
Is that, yes, is that Carlos?
No, it's Charles.
Okay, Charles, sorry, I don't see you. Right, okay, so Charles, take the floor.
I'm sorry, I'm sitting in my car. I'm sitting in my car and listening and taking notes. So you can see a silhouette of me, the entire face. I apologize for that. Jason, thanks for that great presentation. My question is on the other side of this of the equation, though. What needs to happen for China to change track, i.e., look at NUG more seriously?
Yeah, really good question. I think first of all, what needs to happen is that a wide range of countries internationally need to take the NUG more seriously. I mean, we certainly would not expect, given where China's gone and its overall posture and a lot of the sensitivities from the Chinese perspective that I just highlighted, why would we expect China to do more than what other countries have done? And, I think doing things, we've seen now some representative offices start to be opened, but are there ways in which, we could try, different states can try to signal higher levels of recognition to the NUG, whether that's some states that, perhaps don't necessarily require a diplomatic presence or don't have a diplomatic presence, even taking things more in the step of outright recognition of the NUG. I think that could be something to look at. Again, trying to be more deliberate about engaging the NUG on any sort of multilateral platform, or to just have states emphasizing again and again that, hey, the NUG is a more legitimate governance actor than the military is. So why is it that this representation is being controlled or being taken by the military? Why is it not the case that this representation in a particular platform is either suspended, or we're looking more at getting consultation with the NUG side or other parties as well, right? I think that's potentially another step, but I don't think that you're going to see China proactively do this. I think you're going to probably need to see other countries really up their game a little bit in providing higher and higher levels of recognition, support, providing, kind of capacity building, governance strengthening, these sorts of goods to the NUG before you would ever see China begin to do that. And again, at the end of the day, I think ultimately when you're going to start to see things change is only when you really do see it very clearly that the junta, even using violence, is no longer able to hold on. So if those defections start increasing rapidly, if you start to see even greater tracts of territory being lost, if it has to flee, significant additional townships kind of in the center of the country, particularly places where China's economic corridor runs along. I mean, I think if some of those things start to happen as well, you might also begin seeing China become much more concerned about the situation and potentially look at other possible options.
Okay, thank you, Jason, very much. Please stay with us because we might have a further exchange after the two more speakers.